Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. My name is McNeill. I am an indie game designer here in San Diego. I've been indie for about 5 or 6 years now. For most of that time, I have been working on virtual reality games, but I kind of fell into that accidentally. We can talk about that later if you're interested. Robert invited me here, or suggested the idea to talk about ideas and how do you pick what you're going to actually build as a student or indie game designer. So that's what I'm going to try to focus on. I think I'm going to talk for about half an hour, and then for however long you guys feel like afterwards, we can discuss or do questions and answers or however you want to do it. Sound good? All right, then I present you. I don't know what the actual title was. I didn't.
That's a good idea.
It was a placeholder. I didn't have a good idea for it. All right, but the starting point is going to be where ideas come from. And the answer to where ideas come from is everywhere, anywhere. Anything can be the source of a game idea. I know there's research on brainstorming and generating ideas at a faster pace, and I'm not an expert on that. What I'm going to talk about today is just things that I can offer from my experience that I think have helped me. And the big tip that I offer for coming up with ideas is just be open to them from anything that you encounter, any of your experiences. So I have a Google Doc that I call my idea archive. And for the last 10 years or so, I've been just putting game ideas in there whenever they've occurred to me. And so I flipped through that, and I can remember where all these ideas came from. So I just wanted to share some of those to give a sense of kind of the breadth of what could go into it. And I don't know, this is all coming from just one nerdy guy, but even for me, it's coming from all sorts of weird sources. So I had an idea for an abstract mobile game that is based on this wallpaper I found on DeviantArt. The game looks like this, obviously. I had an idea for a strategy game based on ancient maritime trading states, based on a history of ancient Rome that I was listening to as an audiobook. A game about a 3-course dinner, the idea being that it comes with a set of recipes and you and your friends have to include those as you play through the evening. A game about coming up with really stupid startup ideas. Probably you flip cards it's like Facebook, but for dogs or something like that. A game based on international relations where you're trying to balance escalation versus mobilization and readiness and trying not to let things go too far but to be ready if they do. This was inspired by a book about the World Wars that I was reading. A game about the behavior of gunslingers before a shootout from when I was in my Clint Eastwood Westerns phase. A game played upon the paintings of Mondrian. What I'm imagining here is I see this and I cannot help but think of this as a game where maybe you're dragging from cell to cell, bleeding colors into each other or something like that. A game based on John Rawls' A Theory of Justice from my philosophy class in school. A game where you and your friends are trapped on a desert island and you have to cooperate in some way to get out of it. A game based on classic dilemmas from game theory, which I tried to condense and turn into a card game, which I actually prototyped. This inspired by another class I was taking in school, government class on game theory. There's also a game that I wanted to mention that wasn't one of mine, but you may have seen if you're reading game news and blogs. About a week ago or so, or just a few days ago, somebody posted a trailer for a game where you play as a goose. You play as just a jerk goose who runs around the garden, pulling up the plants and getting the gardener wet and stealing his keys and just being a total nuisance. They posted on Twitter, the team that made that, the moment where they had that idea and brought it to the rest of the team. And this is the screenshot from their Slack chat where he says, "Let's make a game about this." And it is literally a crappy stock photo of a goose. And you can go look this up. They sort of go through their brainstorming after that, and they're just oh my God, it's amazing. It's just 2 colors, and they're always cross, whereas ducks are happy, and these are just amazing. And that turned into this whole phenomenon that took over the internet for a day and is probably going to turn into a big hit indie game sometime next year. So ideas can come from anywhere, but ideas themselves are cheap. I don't think they're that valuable on their own. It depends on how you define an idea. I think if you develop the idea in your head a lot and you actually build it out into a coherent game design, then maybe that has more value. But all the things that I've just told you right now are real game ideas of mine that I have maybe prototyped or maybe not yet, or I hope to. And I'm not really worried about anybody stealing those ideas, because an idea expressed by one game developer is going to be so different than the expression of that by another game developer. So I wouldn't say you should focus too much on the ideas themselves. In that spirit, here's a couple more free ideas from my archive. A rhythm RTS, where it's like a simplified RTS game and you have to make decisions based on the beat, sort of like what Crypt of the Necrodancer did for roguelikes. A tower defense game that has time rewind mechanics, sort of like Braid, so you can go back and try to build like the perfect system looking forward. And then this is just quoted from my idea archive, a conversation game where you're chatting with an artificial intelligence, trying to convince it to kill itself. That has been sitting in my Google Doc for like 5 years. And again, like a couple days ago, I read about a new indie game called Localhost, where the cyberpunk game where you talk AIs into allowing themselves to be deleted. Mostly, I'm just happy that this game like exists. But I also know that if I tried to pursue that idea 5 years ago or whenever I had it, it would have come out very, very different from what they created. What it looked like in my mind is so different from this. And I don't feel like there's anything lost in that. I could still go and make my version, and there's a PR hit, I guess. Maybe it's not a great business decision anymore, but like this game is still so different from the one that would have spawned from my idea. So the advice is let ideas come to you. Be open to them. Jot them down in a journal or whatever works for you, and don't worry too much about like the value of each idea. Don't hold on to them too closely. Be willing to move from one to another. And if that just doesn't work for you, if your problem is that you just don't have any ideas, good. I've talked to a couple people so far who are game developers, professional game developers, who have told me like, I want to make games, but I just have no ideas for what I want to turn into a game. And I think that if that describes you, then like thank God for you, because whenever I am working with somebody else and we're working on like, we both have a ton of ideas and we're working on just one person's idea, I feel guilty or jealous depending on which side of the equation I'm on. If you are somebody who doesn't have ideas but wants to work in games, team up with people. Find somebody who has a strong vision that you can contribute to. And if you're fascinated by the process or just being able to work within games, then great. Don't worry about it. Ideas exist. And you can follow the lead of that other person. So now that I've denigrated those ideas so much, I want to go to the bulk of this talk, which is evaluating which ideas you're actually going to pursue. I think this is the hardest part for a lot of people, especially people who are just getting started in game development. There's a lot of ways in which it can go wrong. I think it's easy to get ideas that you get excited about, and it's often harder to figure out the ones that are going to turn out well if you try to turn them into a full project. So this is the framework that I use, formally or informally, when I'm considering all the different ideas I have and trying to decide what I'm going to commit myself to. So the categories are games that you want to make yourself, games that you have the ability and resources to make, and then whatever external constraints and goals you're working within or towards. And I'll talk about each of these in turn. So first, looking at what you want to make, looking at your internal motivation and what you want to see in the world. So a couple different ways that you can look at this. I think the most obvious one is what you want to play yourself, the game that you wish existed for you. And I think it's pretty clear, like there's a lot of motivation that comes with that. You know what it looks like, especially, and you know when you're getting closer to it. And there's kind of this element of wish fulfillment of like, oh, this thing that I wanted to exist in the world now exists. Except only sort of, because it's kind of crappy and it's the first iteration of it and you're seeing the sausage get made, and by the time you actually get to play the finished version, you've been sitting in front of it for 300 hours. And yeah, it may not actually fulfill that original desire, but there's still like this real cool factor involved of like, oh, this is the game that I wanted. The advantage here is also that there's people like you out in the world, probably, and so you have a sense of whether you're appealing to your audience. And then you have like the most clear vision of what you want it to look like. Whereas if you're making games towards other people's desires, there's a slight disconnect, which you can use design skills to get towards, but it's a little bit harder, I think. Then you can look at what would actually be fun to build. What would be fun to work on? Because as I mentioned, in that last section, like most of the time, you're not going to be working on the finished game. You're not going to have that in front of you that you had the vision of at the beginning. You're going to be slogging through all the process that gets you there. And so I think it's really helpful to try to look at what would be fun in the moment. In all of those in-between hours, what would be fun like to tinker with and to work on, as opposed to something where like, oh, now I have to make like the 300th tree asset or something like this for my game that's set in a forest, or I don't know. Think ahead to like what the actual tasks are going to be, and try to imagine like, are you going to enjoy that process, or are you going to hate yourself for putting yourself in that position? And then lastly, what games do you want to see other people playing? Or stated another way, like what games do you want to exist in the world? I hear some game designers talking about, I want to build a game that my kids can play, or I want to build a game that like it's finally going to show my dad why I spend so much time playing video games, or something like that. I felt a little bit of this with some of the games I've made, where I feel like it's sort of a letter to the rest of the world, like, hey, this is what I think is cool about this genre, this style of game, and I'm trying to boil it down and make it accessible so that you can understand it too, and now we can share this. You can also look at this as from the perspective of like external effects that you're hoping to have on the world. Like maybe you're trying to make a game that is educational, or maybe you're trying to make a game that advocates for a certain purpose, and that can be kind of a source of motivation for you as well. Then next set of category, or the next category to look at, is what you have the ability to make. And I think this is probably the most important thing that I'll talk about here, because I think this is where students in indies are most likely to get tripped up, because we have such low resources. And there's a few like mistakes that I think, they're sort of like jokes at this point, but things that game design teachers have seen in their students over and over again, or that you hear from people who are just looking to get into game development, but they don't really know what that entails. And so one of them is, oh, it's like this awesome AAA game, but even better. And I understand the appeal of that, because those are the games that you're in love with, or you can imagine how much cooler it can be. But you are not a AAA game developer at this point. And you might not be able to compete at that level. I think it's smarter to try to figure out what your competitive advantage is and try to work from that perspective. Another common mistake is constantly moving from idea to idea without finishing anything. It's really easy once you're in that sort of less fun, slog of the process of it, especially if you decided to work on a game that's not going to be as fun to work on. It's easy to get seduced by the next idea. You get inspired by something and you say, okay, you know what? This idea is going to be twice as good as the last one anyway. I'm going to cut my losses, stop working on the old one, and work on the new thing. Sometimes that's appropriate, but if you just do that over and over again, then you never finish anything. I think you should try to have some discipline when you're working on your first games, or games in general. Like, try to finish it in some sense. Try to get it to the point where it runs on another person's machine, and maybe they can learn how to play it without you standing over them explaining every step of it. Put it out in the world, especially if you are a student or somebody just getting started. Like, just broadcast it. Just put it on Twitter or whatever it is that you can do, and call it finished. And that, I think, can kind of give you closure, and it can teach you the skill of actually finishing projects. And then another classic mistake is getting really wrapped up in the backstory or the lore that you want to do. Or writing like an enormous game design document that's 100 pages and explains everything that is going to ever happen in this game. Game design is great, but if you're doing that to that extent, you're probably doing it to the exclusion of actual game development. It's probably taking you further away from the end point than getting you closer to it. And a lot of the time, you're in better position to like do this fun stuff once you actually have a game in your hands and you know how it's going to turn out. I think it's okay to like write cool lore or get into a big fancy game design if you understand that that is the project. If what you're sitting down to do is write a cool game design document, great, do that. If what you want to do is build a game, I advise focusing on the game and not falling down the rabbit hole. So how do we avoid these mistakes? Look at what you have the ability to make from your personal perspective. What's within your resources in terms of the time that you can devote to it, in terms of the team that you might be able to work with, in terms of the budget that you might have available. Then your skills, what you know how to do. You might, be really good at one thing or another thing. So look at what you're good at. Look at your specialty. If you are an artist and you can make great art, but you're not as good on coding and things like that, there are genres that are great for that. Look towards things like visual novels or something that there's a lot of new art presented to the player, but it doesn't necessarily need the systems underneath to be as deep. On the other side, if you are mostly a coder or designer and you don't have those art skills, try to make something that uses a few assets and recontextualizes them and mixes them up and presents them in interesting systems. If you're an audio guy or a musician, you can make a game that focuses on that and brings it, to the fore and highlights that for the player. How do you know what you're good at? Look at what you've done before, and then try to think about what you feel confident in doing in the future, which kind of, is very vague and covers everything. But what I'm trying to get at here is if you've done something, then you can repeat that. And then as you try to gain new skills, I think there's sort of a frontier that you keep on expanding. You keep pushing backwards, where there's a few things that maybe you've never done before, but you've read about them or you kind of thought about doing them before, and you have a sense in your head of what that would entail. And I think that's kind of the level that you want to incorporate into your next game. But don't go too far beyond that. I think if you start writing down that your game is going to be all about some system or technology that you've never used before, you have no idea how to use, then you're setting yourself up for trouble. What you can do, though, is prototype. Prototype to add to your skills and to reduce the risk of uncertainty. I think this is one of the most valuable things you can do in a game jam or just on a weekend or something like that. Start a project that is not a game that you're going to finish. You define it from the beginning as a prototype that you're going to throw away at the end of it. And you know it. It's not going to ship. It's just for your own, sake. You're not making a game here. You're just prototyping something. And then if it turns out well, it starts to feel good, you know what you're doing, you feel like you can, expand on it, start over, throw all that away, make the game after that. Almost all of the games that I've actually launched professionally have been actually the second or third version of that game, if you're including prototypes. I made on one of my games I did a 2-day version of it for a game jam just to see if it felt cool, and I thought it did. And then later I did a few weeks version for another contest actually that was actually building it out. And then I decided, okay, I want to make this game. Threw all that away, used all the skills I had, and I felt like I was in a good position to make the final product. Then there's the secret to all game development, the key to finishing your projects. The most important thing that I will be telling you in this entire presentation: scope your projects as small as you can, meaning design them to be limited. Don't put too much into it. Don't bite off more than you can chew. Whatever you think that you want to make, figure out a way to make it smaller, 10 times smaller, especially if you've never done anything before. I guess I'm curious, among the people in this room, who has built a game before in any sense? Okay, who has built a game that they have then launched just to friends and family or free on the internet or something like that? Okay, and who has built a game and launched it commercially? Cool. So a lot of you have done your first game, already. I still think this applies to, the steps that you take after that. And, I think that there's a lot of room to move from that sort of first, I have built something and I've built it and launched it in some sense, tried to get it out to the world, because there's a lot of value in that. But I think the secret to actually making that happen, to getting to the finish line, is just bringing the finish line way, way closer to you. So as I was talking about before, like focus on the stuff that you know that you can do, that you feel like you can do well, and then just kind of find a way to cut out everything else because you actually don't need it most of the time. This is a screenshot of the first game that I ever made. It's called Bombardment. It was built in my free time in my AP computer science class in high school. It was made in Java. You can't really see it because of the terrible color scheme, but there's a little turret there that's made of a circle and a line, and there's some triangles and things. Red bombs spawn randomly on the x-axis on the top and fall randomly to the x-axis on the bottom, and you can shoot them. And then there's levels where every time you get to a certain point in time, a new wave of bombs come and you get a certain amount of ammo. And the game was terrible, and that was great. It was fine. It was enough for me to show it to all my friends and like pass it around and be like, hey, you try this. And they could actually compete amongst themselves to get high scores, and that was really rewarding. And this, I think, is like was a good starting point. If I had tried to make something more complex than this, I think I would have gotten bogged down and maybe never have finished it and then never become a game developer. The world would just be a tragedy. This is a screenshot of my first commercial game, Orlux. First, I sometimes call it my first game when I'm trying to make it sound more impressive. It is actually my 9th game. And that's not including just prototypes. That's including games that like have a menu and that I passed around to people, like tried to put out into the world. Let's zoom in a little on this. This game is a really simplified real-time strategy game. The art assets include blurry dots of different colors, public domain images of the sun from NASA, and the cool light effect is the supernova effect from the GIMP, the free image editing tool. And that's it, basically. That is everything that went into this game. So I made this game when I was in college, between mostly my junior year, a little bit of my senior year. Art was all free. The music was Creative Commons. The engine was XNA, was free from Microsoft. I used the free version of my image editing tool, Audacity for audio, whatever the student version of Visual Studio was at the time. I put this quote from some famous French guy at the top of the website. Perfection is achieved not when there's nothing more to add, but when there's nothing left to take away. The idea here was I have very limited resources and can't make a big game, so I'm going to make that the selling point. Instead of this being the weakness that I had, I tried to frame it as my strength. Look at how simple this game is. Isn't that great and amazing? It's not going to distract you with all sorts of like good art and things like that. I was also pretty lucky in terms of the timing of when this game was done. It was finished in 2010, and I think it was first published online in January 2011, and I posted it on Reddit, and I said, hey, as a thank you to all the people on Reddit who beta tested for me, I'm going to make my $5 game free for 24 hours. And I had no way of regulating it, so I just put up a public download link that I removed after 24 hours, and that was enough to get me to the top of Reddit. I remember it was Martin Luther King Day, and my post displaced the post about Martin Luther King. So I call that a success. That led to a company coming along and asking to port it to mobile. And once it was there, it actually became kind of a hit. It got like 2 million downloads since then. They came back and we did a sequel in the same way, sort of like 50-50, where they did most of the engineering, which was awesome. And basically, this game funded my indie game career. This was what allowed me to go indie and feel like I had some room to fail when I started out doing that. So the last category that I wanted to talk about was external constraints and goals that you might be working towards. Most of the time for like an indie game developer, that's going to be, what do I think the market is going to support? What's going to put food on the table? I don't want to get into that subject too deep because I don't know how confident I am that I know the answer, and also it's just very complicated. But yeah, most of the time you're going to be looking at what other people want and are willing to pay for. But there's other motivations that can come into play as well, especially if you're looking at it from a student perspective. Like if this is for a class, you need to take into account what the teacher is looking for. If you're trying to build your portfolio, then you might deliberately be trying to sort of push on the frontier of your knowledge or build things that will look good, at first glance, or might be impressive to an employer. Show skills that they're looking for. If you're working for a contest or a game jam, you have to take that into account. If you're trying to hit a certain date, work with certain people, anything like that. That's all kind of wrapped up in this. There's a certain set of games that fit within that category that can be done there, and you kind of have to take that into account. The way that I think about these three categories is I don't focus on any one of them. I'm not sort of like, oh, here's a game idea that I really love, let me see if it fits. It's more like just trying to stay aware of all of them and find things that meet in the middle. And so I guess, as I get all these ideas, I sort of am running them through a filter. I'll write them all down just in case their day will eventually come. But I'm always thinking, okay, well, could I actually do that? Do I have the time for it? Would it work? Do I know how that would be done? Would people like this game? I don't know, putting it through all of these, different criteria. And what you find is that some games are going to hit that sweet spot. Some of them are going to be things where you're like, oh, actually that would be pretty easy to do. And I think it might actually be kind of quick. Oh, and maybe I can get funding for it. Or, this actually might be kind of popular, or whatever. And once you find that, then I think you have something good that you can actually try to work on. If you're lucky, you have multiple ideas like that, and you're having to juggle them and decide among them. But I feel like you have a lot of flexibility within these categories. You can decide sort of what your own goals are and what your own standards are for what you're going to accept. But you want to think about all of them, otherwise you can put yourself in a lot of trouble and you might not finish the game. The framework's really messy. These categories are not exclusive and orthogonal, and they are inelegant and offend me as a game designer, but they're useful. I think that it's a way to think about things, even though, what you have the ability to do and what your external constraints are, that kind of overlaps a lot. Or, maybe my external goal is to educate people and maybe that's, what I want to do. I don't know. Yes, there's overlap, but I think this is a healthy way of thinking about it and deciding what you're going to work on.